All right, we are heading into a live stream at Jay's Analysis. You're listening to Jay Dyer. How's the sound, everybody out there? We got some nerds in the audience already. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? We're going to be looking through some articles. We're going to be doing some analysis here, and this is both sad and good at the same time, this situation with what's happening in Ukraine and with Bartholomew. Now, as you know, if you follow Jay's analysis, you know that we've talked about Ecumenism and Freemasonry and geopolitics and all of this related to the religious and theological world for a long time. And 10 years ago, when I was beginning to look into Orthodoxy, maybe even 11 or 12 years ago now, and move out of the realm of traditional Roman Catholicism, I received a lot of heat because at that time I knew about Freemasonry. I knew about these kinds of plots and schemes. And when I went into the world of Orthodoxy, I received a lot of the same flack that I received in previous religious circles. Now, I wasn't super surprised. I was aware that different organizations, different subversive entities had for a long time been interested in altering the landscape of civilizations, and in particular religions, and that wasn't restricted to Catholicism. It goes across the board. And we know, if you know the history of Freemasonry, you know that it's a secret society dedicated to not just the maintenance of secrets and so forth, but it's dedicated essentially to fixing or altering society in their perspective. And it's essentially based on atheism, or at the highest levels, a form of, quote, Luciferianism, which is essentially just the worship of reason. So whether you take it in the direction of something like Crowley or the occult, which is a kind of graduate school of Freemasonry, or whether you just take it in the direction of scientism or something like the Royal Society, it's basically secularism or a variant of communism, socialism, or utopianism. So if we go back to Bavaria, if we go back to Adam Weishaupt, we find that he taught communism. And there is a strain, there is a continuation of the Illuminist doctrine down through various lodges and into Buonarroti and into Gramsci and into the Trotskyites, the Leninists, different characters who continued this utopian ideology, and they were in effect Illuminists in different senses and degrees. And by that we just mean that they adopted the principles of communism in the Weishaupt sense. So that is a real thing. But in the bigger scheme, you can see this in a geopolitical spectrum as being a way to influence and control nations. Now, one of the ways that we can show that is if we look at the book that I've mentioned many times, and we're just going to step out of the realm of the theological and the esoteric and consider the geopolitical for a while, because a lot of and I'm not saying it's all geopolitics. I think a lot of people make mistakes by looking at these issues and they get sidetracked into either or. So they think, oh, this is all geopolitics. Oh, it's all esoteric. And a lot of the people who criticize me when I first started looking into these things, when I was first looking into Orthodoxy, they have no idea about geopolitics. They don't know anything about it. They don't have a clue what it's about. Many of them were just run-of-the-mill boomer neocons. And I knew that, so I can't be too mad at them. But what I'm getting at here is really the events of the last few weeks, the last week especially, have done nothing but vindicate everything that I've talked about. Not just in the last few years, but in the last 12 years, 13 years, 15 years. And what you'll notice is that, especially after the 1700s, because the Grand Lodge of England is the world center of Freemasonry, the Freemasonic society, which is global, becomes a tool of the British Empire. So this should be a no-brainer. It's not hard to figure this out. This is not a conspiracy book. This is a mainline academic book, and it describes the lodges as tools of the British Empire. And if you know your history, if you know the geopolitical texts that you've heard me lecture on, Tragedy and Hope and so forth, we know how this fits into the Anglo-Atlanticist U.S., U.K., ultimately in the 20th century, U.S., U.K., and Israel perspective. It's not hard to figure this out. It shouldn't even be controversial. How many saints and writers and theologians have been talking about this, especially the Freemasonic element, for years? And I'm surprised that anybody who claims to talk about religion or claims to be some kind of academic doesn't know this stuff. It's not hard to figure this stuff out. It's all out there in the public, and it's not even in conspiracy books. I mean, you can find some correct conspiracy books, obviously, but I'm saying that if, for example, we look at the 1933 condemnations of Freemasonry by just one example church, the Orthodox Church, why would the Greek church feel the need to condemn Masonry in 1933 if there's no such thing as a Masonic conspiracy? Well, in 1933 they thought there was. But you'll get mainline so-called Orthodox websites like Jon Stannah, who supports all the ecumenists and who believes that the Bible has errors and all kinds of ridiculous things. And Jon Stannah over at Mystagogy, he won't do a public debate. Well, he knows he won't. Of course he won't, because he'll lose. But he calls all this crazy, even though his own church, well, this idiot, and his own church condemns Freemasonry, and he says this is all lunacy. Well, I wonder if old Jon Stannah himself might be a Mason. He certainly wasn't mad at me when I was making esoteric Platonic posts. In fact, he would retweet and repost some of my old articles. So it's amusing to me that a couple years ago, Stannah called me a lunatic and a moron, and he had forgotten that like 8 years ago he still had my articles on his website. So what does that say for him that he posts a lunatic and a moron? Well, that makes him a double lunatic moron. But anyway, that doesn't matter. Jon Stannah doesn't matter. Jon Stannah has no idea what he's talking about. I've spent years on these topics. I know what I'm talking about. And it's not hard to figure out whether the Orthodox churches historically have condemned Freemasonry. Of course they have. It's a no-brainer. So now that we know this, let's look at one example of, if you look at the title screen that I put up, which was from geopolitica.ru, you'll notice that there was a great article about the influence of Freemasonry in early Greek ecumenism. And this is just one example. It's not like it's going to be different anywhere else. But let's look at this great quote from St. Nikolai Belem Ravitch, who is a famous saint. I guess he's a lunatic conspiracy theorist as well. And this is on the issue of Freemasonry in the Greek church and ecumenism. He says, the issue of Freemasonry, the Great Council of Constantinople noted on its own, lists some heresies by their name, Uniatism, Chiliasm, and the Masonic danger, which outweighs all the others, and numerous intellectuals who happen to be affiliated with it. It is the new Arianism, and before it stands a great struggle, which we have to undertake fearlessly in the name of God. The greatest threat to Christianity of the world is not Bolshevism or something else, but Freemasonry, because it is an enemy of both external and internal, that is, they will infiltrate the church. We say that the Christian religion is the religion, the sole religion, and that orthodoxy is the only true one. But they, the Freemasons, renounce the gospel, and they put Christ on a level with Moses, Buddha, and Muhammad. Well, what does Jon Stannah adoption of errors throughout Scripture do? Well, it does the exact same thing. And Jon Stannah, by the way, he calls the people who reject ecumenism, he calls them fundamentalists and anti-Semites. What does that tell you about Jon Stannah? But I would say this essay at geopolitica.ru, which I just read today, and because I had shared this a long time ago, but I actually forgot about it. Go read this. It's a great essay, and it deals with the history of ecumenism in Greece. So that's one aspect of this that we need to see that's crucial, that many, especially American Orthodox, are they're idiots about this. They don't know anything about this. They think it's crazy. It's not crazy. It's basic history. In fact, Philip Sherrard, of all people, who eventually caved and became a liberal, in his book, Greek East, Latin West, he talks about the Freemasons being behind the revolution in Greece. Well, of course they are. They're behind all the revolutions. They brag about it. Excuse me. But if you read this essay, some notes about the influence of Freemason in Greece, it will give you a history of the patriarchs, especially Patriarch. Excuse me. It wasn't just Meletios Metaxakis. It was also Patriarch Joachim. Patriarch Joachim, who really got Freemasonry and ecumenism going in Greece, who was Patriarch of Constantinople in the 1800s, late 1800s. There was already Freemasonry at the highest levels of the Greek church. No surprises there. But then he goes on, this monk that wrote this essay will go on to speak of the rest of the famous intellectuals and academics in Greece who had already adopted Freemasonry, and who wrote about the fact that ecumenism was the means by which the church could be brought into accepting new doctrines, basically leaving all the classic Orthodox doctrines of the ecumenical councils, the first 8 ecumenical councils, and then the later authoritative Orthodox councils. This is all detailed very well in that essay. So that's a great readable, I don't know, what is it, 20 pages? It's a 20-page way to start out with this question. Now, I went into more detail in a talk I did a while back with some of my buddies, John and Chris, that I would also recommend, because the attempt to
Catholic world
to alter society was not just related to the religious realm and Freemasonry involved in Rome or Orthodoxy. It also dealt with public education. It dealt with the United Nations, and it dealt with a lot of support from especially the Rockefellers. The Rockefeller family was instrumental in ecumenism. They put tons and tons of money into it. This is detailed in their own personal biography. And so you can watch or listen to a really detailed account of all that in Mystery Babylon, The History of Ecumenism, Public Education, and Geopolitical Intrigue, where I deal with that question specifically, and we go on for about 3 hours in that talk. So there's a lot of notes and details there that help solidify the case, the overall perspective here. And then I would also recommend the interview that I did. Sorry, I'm trying to pull up these interviews at the same time as I'm talking, and it's coming through the speakers, so I can't pause it quick enough. You'll want to listen to the interview with Father Peter Heers, Orthodoxy, Rome, Vatican II, and Ecumenical Collapse. And this looks at the same issue in relationship to Vatican II in his book from the Orthodox perspective. So the good news is that a lot of people are starting to wake up to this and starting to figure it out. And, maybe Jay isn't that crazy. Maybe the stuff he's talked about, because he actually read the Masonic documents and the globalists over the last 20 years, maybe he actually knows what he's talking about. And he's not just making this stuff up. And it's not just crazy conspiracy theorists. Now, we want to look at a couple things that help us understand from the geopolitical perspective. And that's because a lot of this, we could wish, it would be good actually if we were in a situation where a lot of this was happening because of theology, and people were so devoted to theology that they were condemning one another and dealing with these issues in the public sphere because they were so devoted. No, but no, that's not really what's going on. A lot of this is geopolitics. And for example, if we want to understand the Ukraine situation, basically there's 3 different groups in Ukraine that claim relationship to being true orthodoxy, right? So there's the canonical church, which is under the jurisdiction of Moscow. It's been recognized for centuries. The entire Orthodox world has agreed against Patriarch Bartholomew that this is Russian territory. That's because Ukraine historically is Russia. It is not. It's actually a creation of the Anglosphere. The Ukrainian nation is a creation of World War I and World War II. And all we have to do to understand this is to look at the phony Ukrainian patriarch, Filaret, and he is the CIA NATO puppet. And John McCain, you can see here, went over there right before the 2014 coup, quote unquote, where the Western media said that Russia has divided Ukraine and all this nonsense, just like they said with Georgia. No, to the contrary, it's the CIA and NATO in the West that are behind the skullduggery here. And you can see, here's John McCain meeting with this phony patriarch, Denisenko Filaret, who, by the way, was formerly a Soviet. So let's not hear any of that nonsense about, oh, it's the KGB behind all this. Oh, really? How come that guy is the one who's the Soviet? No. And this is really just a part of the larger NATO-U.S. strategy of the last several decades, right? Brzezinski's Arc of Crisis, the old World War I and World War II strategy of splitting up nations into halves, right? North, South Korea, right? East, West, Germany. This is the geopolitical strategy of the globalists. And it's the exact same thing as that you've seen in all these countries. So in other words, what happens in Ukraine is no different than what they're doing right now in Syria, what they're trying to do, right? What they did in Libya, the exact same thing, right? If you don't know who NATO is and who John McCain works for and why he's there, then don't criticize me and don't start talking crap, because this is basic. This is geopolitics 101. John McCain is over there to promote the CIA and the NATO agenda. It's a no-brainer. It's obvious. It's not hard to figure out. And who do you think Bartholomew works for? He works for these guys. That's why he's propping up the CIA NATO puppet. Why do you think he's doing it? Because he works with these guys. Who else does John McCain work with? ISIS? Remember that? John McCain goes and meets with ISIS leaders. Are you starting to figure this out? Can you figure this out yet, neocon, so-called Orthodox? John McCain with his ISIS buddies. Let's look at that picture. The freedom fighters. Yeah, still trotting out that same old neocon, mujahideen nonsense. Here's your buddy John McCain in his 2013 trip with Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, right? These are ISIS guys. And this is admitted in mainstream media. Everybody knows this. This is not a conspiracy theory. It's well known. Have you figured it out yet? Am I going to get... can't wait to see the neocon Orthodox so-called who start messaging me over this. And then, ironically, in response to this week, we got AP, Reuters, these fake sites, these CIA sites, promoting this nonsense narrative, made-up narrative that Russian hackers have hacked poor Patriarch Bartholomew. and the OCA. So is the OCA, who are they going to side with? Are they going to get their orders from Langley and side with Patriarch Bartholomew? Are they going to believe this obvious nonsense of the Russian hackers? Or maybe this is not true. Maybe we could recall the Vault 7 WikiLeaks leaks about how the CIA can hack. Remember, they can spoof the IP of any country and make it look like it's anybody. Let's take a look at that. I'm going to play this clip here. This mentions some of the WikiLeaks Vault 7 thing, and this came out because of this was on the wings of the Russian hack nonsense, which is made up. And this was leaked because they were trying to show you that the CIA can spoof and say that anybody hacked. Of course they can.
Well, we start the program with some breaking news. The CIA has lost control of the majority of its hacking arsenal, which could fall into the wrong hands around the world. That's according to the latest revelation from WikiLeaks. Well, for more on this, we can now cross live to our correspondent in London, Polly Boyker. Polly, good to see you. Now, what implications might this report have?
Well, they're calling this leak Vault 7, and they're claiming that this is the largest ever leak of secret CIA files. According to WikiLeaks, the CIA has lost control of the majority of its cyber weapons, this arsenal of cyber weapons that it has. Things like malware, viruses, Trojans, and various remote control systems. So all the tricks that spies use in order to survey their targets. And what WikiLeaks is saying is that the CIA arsenal of these tricks has already been leaked and circulated among former government hackers. And WikiLeaks knows this because one of those former US government hackers has passed on parts of this dossier onto WikiLeaks. The files contain so-called weaponized exploits, so methods for spying on anyone, anywhere, through familiar devices, ones like Apple, Google, and Microsoft phones. Even the iPhone that runs the presidential Twitter account could be subject to these vulnerabilities. And also, in conjunction with MI5, it appears in these files that the CIA has created a special type of malware that can infest Samsung smart TVs, which all have covert microphones that can be turned on through this type of malware. And what's interesting here is that after the publication of the Snowden leaks, the Obama administration had obliged the CIA to reveal any so-called vulnerabilities about all these devices, about the tech industry, essentially. According to these documents, they haven't done that. They've hoarded all of these vulnerabilities in order to be able to use them themselves. But because their cyber arsenal, it seems now, isn't secure, and it has turned out to not be secure, this information is already spread to other hackers, and that clearly presents a security risk. WikiLeaks has said that the person that passed this information onto them, their source, wants to initiate a public debate about democratic oversight of cyber weapons, which of course is very reminiscent of the motives behind Edward Snowden's leaks. And WikiLeaks say that their source and the organization itself is concerned that once a cyber weapon is loose, the way that they're claiming this CIA arsenal is now unsecure, it can be spread very quickly. It can be used by bad people for nefarious purposes, cyber mafia, rival states, teenage hackers, you name it. So all this is about cyber proliferation. There are two layers of concern here. One is what the CIA is able to do and whether there is enough democratic oversight and accountability of the CIA's capabilities, but also concerns that those capabilities aren't even secure and anybody could get their hands on them.
Now, I made at least 2 or 3 2-hour long analyses a year, 2 years ago about all of this. And everything I said has been proven absolutely 100% correct. And has anybody from the world of orthodoxy said, oh, maybe you're... No, they have not. No. In fact, they've only been more cowardly and afraid. But the point of all this is just rather to show that we can't believe these stupid articles and these stupid titles, especially, and even, of course, the Vatican was promoting this. The Catholic News Agency was promoting this, that the Russian hackers are trying to foil and mess with Bartholomew. Bartholomew has messed himself. We don't have to. He doesn't have to be messed with. He is a disgrace to himself. But I want to add too that it helps to understand the Ukraine crisis. I'm all over the place here because I got like a million articles open. But if we want to understand this Ukraine crisis, my friend Mark Hackard, who followed this intently at the time, and he was on RT, he gave a great interview explaining what happened in this coup and how it was a NATO operation at the behest of Wall Street, the CIA, and so forth. And again, that's not hard to figure out. Here is McCain going over there, and before that, Soros was pumping billions into the Orange Revolution in Ukraine all the way back to the 90s. Remember, Victoria Nuland talked about this? Soros and the State Department working to achieve the coup in in Ukraine, which eventually happened in 2014. And so we're going to listen to a little bit of Mark here. This is not that long, maybe 5-10 minutes. Mark's going to explain when he was on Crosstalk. And you can find that full interview here if you want to go hear the full interview, which was 2014. You can go listen to that on YouTube. But we're going to listen to just a little bit of this because Mark gives a great breakdown. And in fact, the CIA and NATO used snipers. They used all the same tactics of regime change to cause chaos and destabilization, which they are doing presently in Syria. Exact same model. They just repeat. Rinse, repeat, rinse, repeat, rinse, repeat, rinse, repeat.
Hello and welcome to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. Chicken Kiev, the Western-backed coup regime in Ukraine, appears powerless to stop the rapid collapse of the economy and official structures. The agreed roadmap to de-escalate tensions has gained little traction from the White House and the people of East and South Ukraine. The West started this crisis. Will it be left to Russia to end it? To Crosstalk, the ongoing crisis in Ukraine, I'm joined by my guest, Alexander Mercouris in London. He is a writer on legal affairs and an analyst. In San Francisco, we have Mark Hackard. He is an author and columnist for souloftheeast.org. And in Moscow, we cross to Mark Slobodin. He is a senior lecturer and researcher at Moscow State University. All right, gentlemen, Crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I very much encourage it. Alexander, if I can go to you first in London, what's going on with this roadmap? At the end of last week, we had this agreement to de-escalate the situation in Ukraine, but over the weekend it rapidly deteriorated in Ukraine. So is it a dead letter?
Well, one has to wonder. I mean, the problem is there was a statement which sets out a roadmap. What there is at the moment is a complete lack of any political will to put it into effect. And it has to be said very clearly that that lack of political will is coming at the moment from Kiev primarily, and also from Washington. The moment the document was signed off, we already saw Washington trying to interpret it in its own terms, as requiring people in the East to leave buildings first, and with threats against Russia, threats of more sanctions, and that is really not helpful in a situation like this.
Mark, in Moscow, unhelpful. That's exactly true here. I mean, it seems hard to believe that Barack Obama was dismissing what his own Secretary of State had negotiated with his counterpart, the Russian foreign minister. I mean, again, is this the kind of diplomacy, quote-unquote diplomacy, we can expect in dealing with this crisis in Ukraine?
Well, I think we've seen a extreme deficit in diplomacy out of the United States, not only in the Ukraine, but for some years now. Politico.com just recently did a piece exposing how the majority of U.S. diplomats within Europe are actually paid, Democratic Party activists who have paid large amounts of money to the Barack Obama's political campaign in order to get those diplomatic seats. Cronies, if you will. The majority of the European capitals, diplomats for the United States, are political cronies of the Democratic Party. And this exposes itself in a complete dearth of professional diplomacy. There are very few professional career diplomats within the U.S. diplomatic service. Now, John Kerry himself can be excluded to this to a certain extent, having a long career in foreign service within the Senate. But overall, on the ground, throughout the rest of Europe and all of the other levels of functionaries within the U.S. diplomatic corps, we have seen a complete deficit of professionalism, of knowledge about the region, and the price for U.S. policy and decision-making has clearly been shown.
Mark, in San Francisco, it seems to me, and please disagree if you disagree with the following, it seems to me Washington really doesn't want a solution. It already has it has a goal, and it wants to achieve that goal, but it has nothing to do with democratic forces or the needs and wants of the Ukrainian people. What it wants to do is it wants to make Russia look like it's at fault here. And if you look at Western media, that's all you're going to hear or read.
Yes, that's true. If you look at what recently happened, you have the massacre in Slavyansk by right sector thugs, and that's not going to get reported in the Western media. Washington really doesn't want a solution to the crisis. It works for them if they can destabilize Russia's periphery. And, you know, what's basically happening is that Washington, London, Paris, but especially Washington/Wall Street, are looking to expand their power as far east as possible, and that's what the Maidan Revolution was about. You know, under slogans of freedom and democracy, they want to strip the country of its assets and move NATO forces and missile defense assets to Russia's southwest frontiers.
Alexander, the interesting thing is, I think back to the breakup of Yugoslavia, the bombing of Serbia, and then thinking in terms of what happened recently in Libya. This is the same game plan. Every single time they go through the same procedure. The difference is in Ukraine, Russia is next door, and Russia has a lot of cards to play. Now, it looks, a lot of people are saying that this is a ploy. They want to trick Russia into some kind of move that will start some kind of conflict, would be very limited, but Russia would be the net loser. Do you see that in your crystal ball?
No, I don't, actually. I think that they greatly underestimate Russia's intelligence and sophistication. I think this has been a fundamental problem with the United States looking at Russia. It has a very outdated view of Russia, still based on the 1990s. And I think that anybody looking at the quality of diplomatic service that Russia has and its political leadership, and comparing that with that of the United States, would see that that simply isn't going to happen. Can I just pick up on a point that Mark made? One of the fundamental problems dealing with the United States is that you come up with a statement like the one we saw this week, which in itself could take the thing forward. But what then happens is that people in Washington try to use that statement for propaganda purposes, completely distorting its meaning in order to pursue the agenda that you touched on and which some of the other speakers on our program have touched on. And that, of course, takes us back.
Okay, Mark, in Moscow, you know, I really can't figure this out because on the one hand, it seems to me that Washington really, it has a goal, but it's how it gets there is very ad hoc. They always go back, they're always following news flow and trying to even out the news flow to reflect how they get to their goal. But on the other side, it seems to me that the Russians have prepared for almost every single contingency conceivable, and this is why Washington looks so wobbly all of the time.
Well, I think that from the very beginning of this crisis, the U.S., by openly supporting and fomenting and, by all accounts, funding these Euromaidan riots and putsch in the Ukraine, they have counted on the fact that Russia would simply accept another regime change on their borders, much as Russia did in the color revolution that occurred in Ukraine in 2005. And that Russia, for the sake of maintaining its relations with the West and for the sake of economic relations with the Ukraine as a major trade partner, would accept this change of regime, would accept this geopolitical coup, and would actually fund the putsch regime that the West had just installed there. They had the temerity, William Hague, the British foreign minister, had the temerity to question the Russian government immediately after the putsch took power in Kiev on February 21st and 22nd, if Russia would continue its $15 billion worth of aid to support it. And they act genuinely shocked when Russia, made clear that they wouldn't. So all along there has been this assumption, this misreading of Russia's core national security and identity interests, that they would just accept it. And then the truth is, it was one regime change too many and far too close to Russia's red line security issues.
Mark in San Francisco, Mark in Moscow brings up a very good point. After the illegal coup occurred, look at from the Washington's perspective, they really believe that Russia was going to do nothing. What did they expect Russia to do? I mean, it's on this border. It has national interest there. There are Russian speakers there. There are ethnic Russians there. And Washington truly expected that Vladimir Putin would just say, all right, fine.
Yes, I think that was the case if you look at what happened in the Orange Revolution in 2004, 2005, as Mark in Moscow pointed out. They were expecting that Putin would essentially grin and bear it, but they were basically they wanted history to repeat itself, and they thought that the Ukraine would become essentially an economic satrapy of the European Union, that they could kick out in some period of time the Black Sea Fleet from Sevastopol, and they were probably genuinely surprised when Russia secured Crimea and shifted the agenda so that it turned out that the West was off balance, that the U.S. Was not setting the tune for geopolitics in Eastern Europe.
So anyway, I want to get back to what I'm talking about, and I want to remind people that this, and it's not true that nobody on the right was supporting this stuff in the Ukraine. I've been here doing this the entire time. I know well who's come after me, who's written countless articles about me, because if in this regard I'm the Russian agent, and then of course the other people call me a CIA agent. So anyway, no, John McCain was there supporting this the right wing here in the Ukraine. This is well known, and it's not the case that there were hardly anybody on the right supporting this. There was a sizable section of the right. Now, many alt-right people did. Well, good for them. But I don't really care about the alt-right. I've never identified as alt-right. And that's because the alt-right is a joke. And I said it was a joke, and it was stupid and the nonsensical thing the entire time. That's why I debated every one of them, because what are their foundations? The same as the classical liberals. Even, right, JF, what's his foundations? Atheism, Nietzsche, libertarianism, Darwin. Are there any of them that aren't Darwinists? Not hardly. So what do you think they're going to give you better than any of these alt-left people? Maybe the alt-left has a point in not wanting the neoliberal free trade, gobbledygook going global, right? That's why some sites have been saying, oh, is the alt-right turning liberal? Anyway, we're not here to talk about the alt-right. That's ridiculous. Anyway. We're here to talk about what was prior to any of these idiotic modern political developments, and that is movements like Freemasonry, which were intended to subvert and destroy authentic Christianity. Explicitly. There's no doubt about it. We know it. How many saints and Orthodox does it take telling you that? In the West as well. Like good, well-intentioned people in the West saying the exact same thing. As, Father Rose, St. Nikolai, Belem, Ravitch, St. John of Shanghai, on and on and on and on, warning, talking about the dangers of Masonry. How many patriarchal encyclicals or official statements or canonical condemnations does it take before you realize that this is not a joke, it's not a conspiracy theory, and you can't be a part of these organizations either. You have to leave these organizations because you're spiritually yoking yourself to stuff that is damaging, stuff that is, right? What does Paul say? Do not be yoked together with unbelievers. So the good news is there are some signs of life. There are some signs of people understanding this. And of course, I don't have a huge reach, but some people do listen to me. I'm not saying that the Patriarch of Jerusalem has listened to me, but he at least has understood that what's going on with Bartholomew and the CIA and NATO, these tentacles of globalization, they're trying to destroy Orthodoxy in Ukraine. And he goes on to talk about how it is globalism. Yes, exactly. People are starting to realize this. They're starting to catch on. So that's good news. That's a good sign. But it's going to take more than just that, because my criticism here of, and we can criticize Kirill as well, and the rest of these people, Bartholomew should have been condemned a long time ago, not because of geopolitical things, but because of heresies. And in fact, there have been Greek abbots calling for councils to condemn Bartholomew's heresies for a long time. Athos has been calling for Bartholomew's heresies to be condemned. So Bartholomew is an obvious huckster. I mean, here he is giving his highest award to Joe Biden, the pro-gay, pro-abortion creeper politician. This was a huge scandal. Why wasn't he condemned for this? And that's because in both the East and the West, the church's corruption has led to the point where they're more concerned with geopolitical maneuvers than they are theology. And this is why the Cuba statement of Kirill signifies compromise even at the Moscow Patriarchate. Now, I'm not going to say that that means everybody has lost grace or become some kind of schismatic. That would be ridiculous. But I'm going to tell you that it is true that the Cuba statement, which is Kirill's statement in line with Pope Francis, says that you should not convert Catholics to Orthodoxy and Orthodox should not convert Catholics. Well, I'm sorry, but that's not true. That's heresy. What a derogatory idea against all of the many people who died converting people, right? St. Alexis Toth, who converted tens of thousands of uniates to Orthodoxy. So I guess that doesn't matter anymore. No, that doesn't matter anymore. Because, yeah. So now I'm not saying that that means either of these groups is ideal in terms of, I don't think that we have this KGB apparatus anymore. That doesn't mean that Kirill is beyond criticism. But there's a good article. I mean, I think that if everything was just totally corrupt, like some of these radical, extreme people say, there wouldn't need to be any of this theater anyway. The whole group would have just sided with Bartholomew, right? But everybody should read, who's interested, the article at Orthodox England, which I'll put up here, which talks about this, which is Between Two Thieves, KGB, Russian Orthodox Church, and the CIA. So, yes, it's true that during the Cold War period, yes, it wasn't like it was an either or thing. And when Bolshevism happened and when there was persecution, yes, the CIA, MI6, they coaxed a lot of people into becoming immigrants and expatriating. And, come to the West. It's free. It's liberal here. And then turns out, oops, in the long run, you're just as bad or worse than the commies, right? Do you want straight up persecution, or do you want a long-time liberal degenerate ethos that's going to water down and compromise your whole religion? Either one is shitty. That's the key here. So it's not about picking the perfect guy or the good guy out of two giant political power blocks, because there's going to be corruption on both sides. There's no doubt about that. And certainly it is true that there can be criticism of Kirill. There should be criticism of corruption in the Russian church. There's no doubt about that. But who is worse of these two? I think you can objectively, easily identify that the worst of these two is the West, CIA and NATO. They objectively want to eradicate any remains of Christian civilization and Orthodoxy, especially in the history of civilizations, West or East or Eurasian. I don't think that the rebuilding of the thousands of churches in Russia is all a giant KGB plot. That's ridiculous. That's ridiculous. Russia is not run by the KGB. In fact, if anything, one of the problems of Russia is that Russia is too open to the West. They're too neoliberal. That's one of the problems. The Carnegie Endowment operates openly in Russia. The CFR publications operate openly in Russia. Right now, it's a good thing that Russia kicked out Soros. That's good, but they need to kick out the rest of them because these other groups are just as bad. Okay, so it's not a thing where I'm here to say Russia doesn't have corruption. It does. Its corruption goes back to especially the 20th century with the exportation of Bolshevism from England and the banksters. And guess what? It goes back even further than that, because Peter the Great and Catherine, that's who allowed Freemasonry into Russia. So there's been corruption in Russia for hundreds of years. So, it's not a matter of coming up with simple formulas of good guy, bad guy, especially not in geopolitics. So we're not saying that there's not corruption on both sides. The point is that I don't think that everything about the resurgence of Orthodoxy in Russia is fake or bad news. It's all theatrics. And even if Kirill is compromised or is bad news, so what? I mean, any of these patriarchates ultimately are just bishops. They're not popes, which is ironic because Bartholomew is literally trying to argue that he's like a kind of pope. I'm not joking, by the way. He is literally making this preposterous argument that the Patriarch of Constantinople is an icon of God the Father, and the rest of the patriarchates are kind of it's just retarded. And many people have laughed and just sort of dismissed this, which should be. It should be laughed at and dismissed. So, but anyway, I know all this stuff is kind of complex, especially when you get into the geopolitics of it. And hopefully what I'm talking about here sheds a little light on it, because we're talking about centuries. We're talking about histories of cultures and civilizations. We're talking about subterfuge and skullduggery on the part of intelligence agencies. We're talking about the KGB. We're talking about the CIA and all that. And none of these groups are, quote, good. I mean, if you were being persecuted by an atheist in a communistic regime and you were told by the CIA or MI6, expatriate to the West, you could see why. Okay, yeah, they're our friends. They're going to help us. But then you get here, and 2 or 3 generations later, the CIA and the West are telling your kids to cut their genitals off. Maybe they weren't the good guys after all. Or maybe some of the people during the Cold War, right? They didn't have access at the time of the Cold War to all the information that we have access to. They were subject to the same kind of BS, legacy media, 3 big NBC, ABC crap that we are still fighting today, that's kind of dying now. So they were propagandized too. So there were probably a lot of people in the Cold War that were in the dark, and they thought they were, truly fighting baddies over there somewhere, right? And this is kind of what Eric Blair talks about in 1984. Oh, the bad guys of Eurasia are not our real enemies. That's one of the points of 1984, isn't it? They're fictional enemies created by the Ministry of Propaganda. I'm just using that as an illustration. So anyway, I think this kind of touches on all the major issues that I wanted to get to. I mean, there's not a whole lot here to say. I mean, it's really obvious that Patriarch Bartholomew is a phony. I've been saying that for years. And how could you give awards to war criminals and Satanists and hang out with John McCain and promote all this stuff that's explicitly geared towards tearing down Orthodox Christianity and Christendom, and at the same time say you're a representative of Christ? Well, you can't really. And the Orthodox world should be rebuked for not going after Bartholomew for theological errors and only going after him or realizing it on the basis of some juridical, canonical, geopolitical thing. It shows where the priorities are, and the fact that the priorities are on geopolitics shows that we already have bigger problems in the church. And one of those big problems is the phony, globalized movement of ecumenism, which is part of the move to push everybody into a one world religion. And you can have all of your trappings and costumes, just don't pretend that yours is the right one. Right? Don't pretend that John 14:6 is true. I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but by me. Don't pretend that that's true. Relegate that into the realm of opinion. Everything's relative. Support NGOs and democracies from America and the West and the Pentagon, the CIA and NATO. All those NGOs, open society, promoting relativism, liberalism. Just go along with all that and you can believe anything you want, as long as it's liberal, quote unquote liberal. And all the modern right-wingers are liberal too, by the way. So, Bartholomew, we can see, is compromised. We look at the superstructure of Russia, we can see that it is compromised. We can see that Putin does some good things, but he also does bad things, right? And this is why, for example, Dugin wrote the book Putin versus Putin, calling out the good and the bad in Putin. Right? So and it's similar to Trump, as one of the commenters in the chat said. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Trump does some good things. He also does some bad things. And that's, because at that level, it's very difficult to avoid compromise. And that's the reality of this world. I mean, what we're seeing in the Vatican right now is an example of that. That a lot of this compromise has been as a result of decades of the Vatican working with the CIA. And that led through the doctrinal warfare program, Henry Luce of Time Life magazine, of C.D. Jackson, that led to the co-opting of that institution, especially at Second Vatican Council. That's detailed in David Wimhoff's book, 1,000+ footnotes, right? So that's an angle to understand from this. And the reason I bring up the Vatican is because that kind of compromise is not just Vatican. It also goes on in the other churches. People get compromised. Masons get promoted. People with weird perversions get promoted on purpose because they're compromisable, especially to powerful offices. And it's no different in the Orthodox churches, unfortunately. So, again, one of the saving graces of the Orthodox Church is that it is decentralized, right? So the problem with the papacy, of course, is that it's a house of cards. Once you have an apostate pope, the whole house of cards falls apart, and you have a bunch of double-think Catholics trying to justify papal infallibility, while their head guy is covering up for the most disgusting degenerates ever, and is visibly an apostate, not just a moral corrupt person, but an actual apostate, theologically speaking, which in their own canon law means he's not canonical. And he doesn't have jurisdiction. No heretic or schismatic has jurisdiction in Roman Catholic canon law. Anyway, in a similar way, in the Orthodox world. What this with Patriarch Bartholomew shows is perfectly sensible, or it's nothing out of the ordinary when we think of the history of the church. Because if you're familiar with, say, the first millennium of the history of the church, these kinds of squabbles and schisms and problems happened all the time. And that's because the patriarchal pentarchy or metropolitan type system, the synodal system that you see in the first 1,000 years of the church, the ecumenical councils and the synods, this kind of stuff happened all the time. So in other words, this makes perfect sense. I mean, it's not saying it's a good thing, but I'm saying that this is unfortunately what happens in the history of the church. And of course, over time, these things get ironed out. This stuff has happened many, many times. And there have been countless patriarchs who were heretics. Nestorius, one of the most notorious heretics of all time, was the Patriarch of Constantinople. And it doesn't take an ecumenical council, it doesn't take a PhD or a THD to recognize a heretic or an apostate. When Nestorius started teaching that Jesus was a human person, many of the congregation immediately got up and walked out of the church. And that's because they recognized right away that he was a heretic. It's not really any different now. Bartholomew teaches that you don't have to convert to Orthodoxy. You don't have to, and in fact, you shouldn't convert to Orthodoxy. Well, that's heretical. That must be rejected. That is the Masonic doctrine. Whether he's a Mason or not doesn't even really matter. Right? If he's promoting all the Masonic ecumenist doctrines, it doesn't really matter whether he's a Mason or not. Who cares? You might as well be. You're of the spirit of Masonry. So we can understand that another angle to this, and this is admittedly, I'm speculating here based on some rumors. The Greek Orthodox Archdiocese, of course, which will probably, I haven't looked at their statements, but all of the other statements by any of the other churches have basically condemned Bartholomew. But what this shows is that Bartholomew doesn't take his orders from anybody but John McCain and Joe Biden and the Pentagon, right? CIA and NATO, which is what I've said for at least a decade. So this proves it, by the way. But it also could signify the possible rapprochement of Bartholomew with Rome. And it makes perfect sense, doesn't it? Why would this be happening? Because there is the possibility that Bartholomew and others down the road would like to reunite with Rome. At least they've been talking about this. This has been discussed in all these many ecumenical meetings. And then that, of course, would be fitting, wouldn't it? It would make perfect sense that he would. So this action could signify something related to a possible down the road reunion with Francis or whatever lunatic succeeds Francis in that office. So anyway, those are some thoughts and some speculations. We've got a super chat here from Paul Albert. One of the most Freemasonic bands, Alan Parsons Project, said, "Where do we go from here now that all the children have grown up?" I don't know how that, I don't get the point. I'm not trying to be a dickhead. I'm just saying, like, I don't follow. But I mean, anybody who would follow this loon, John McCain, and that's who you're following if you side with Bartholomew here and all his ecumenical butt buddies. That's who you're siding with here. Oh, and I wanted to mention this too, that the U.S. CIA NATO puppet, there was a great article at Russia Faith, which gets into some of the money in the background. Yeah, so the Filaret, Phony, and Bartholomew have probably cashed in some way in this, and that's what I was wondering. And then I saw this article with the CIA puppet president of Ukraine, returns $15 million to Bartholomew pit. Well, there you go. I would say that this is a big indicator of what's going on. Stick with CIA, NATO. Don't side with Russia in this situation. Here's $15 million, by the way, Bart. Here you go, Bart. Here's $15 million for your bathhouses in Turkey there. So anyway, if anybody wants to send a super chat, ask some questions, be happy to answer those. But I don't think there's a whole lot more to say on this because it's not too difficult to figure out. And it does relate to Masonry, and it does relate to the Vatican being co-opted as a giant institution for the CIA's doctrinal warfare program to spread Americanism and globalism to the rest of the globe. Obviously, they would like to utilize the other religions for this same program, bring them all on board. This is part of the destruction of nation states as well. This globalization program, which is fostered by neoliberal economics, fostered by the Fortune 100, fostered by global banking institutions, usury, fostered by, what else is it fostered by? Technocracy. Someone was asking me today, this is the thing I always try to stress, does this signify the commies have won? Well, if you mean classical Marxist doctrine, no. There are elements of classical Marxist doctrine which do descend into the modern power elite, global elite, certainly. But there's also a lot of aspects of classical Marxism that are not true and don't fit into this. For example, neoliberal capitalism, democracy, democratic capitalism, all of that is not in line with classical Orthodox Marxism. And that's what's running the world and running the show. So the only aspects of Marxism that really continue to translate into the modern ethos would be things like the prevalence of atheism, the usage of dialectics by power structures, the Frankfurt School tradition of Marxism in terms of their cultural applications. That has continued. And that's about it. And maybe the internationalism aspects of Marxism. But other than that, there's not a whole lot in our coming. Oh, I should have mentioned as well, there is history of the green movement in Marxism with Engels. So the austerity, Agenda 21, Club of Rome, that does have a bit of a Marxist tinge to it. Engels actually used to write on environmental issues. He's one of the first environmentalists. You can track that down. And technocracy. Marx did speak of technocracy, but actually Marx thought that the robots would come and basically allow for more freedom. So I don't know that specifically Marx thought that there would ever be like a giant dystopia. So that one doesn't necessarily translate into it, but it's the Western powers, democracy, right? Liberalism. And remember, liberalism fought Sovietism. It fought Marxism. The Soviet Party outlawed homosexuality and all these things, right? It was opposed to usury. The Western systems promoted homosexuality, LGBT, all of that stuff as a psychological warfare, propaganda means to show, quote, freedom. Okay, so now I'm not saying when I say that means Sovietism was good. It's not. But it's a dialectic that was managed, and this is something that we constantly talk about at Jay's Analysis. This is why we don't promote Yuri Bezmenov, because Yuri Bezmenov doesn't tell you that it was the CIA and the OSS that brought the Marxists over, right? He tells you the Marxists infiltrated the Western institutions. Yeah, because they were brought over by the CIA and the OSS, because it's just techniques. It's just systems of control. So don't fall into these kind of camps of, oh, I'm with the SS. Oh, I'm with the Soviets. Oh, I'm with Stalin. Oh, I'm with the Juki, whatever that gobbledygook of North Korea is. All that stuff is silly, right? None of these modern political movements at all are worth anything. Now, some are worse than others, obviously, right? The total SJW type stuff is literally the goblin people of Walmart type stuff is the worst. But all of the modern political positions are based on secularism and atheism. So that's why you don't see me promoting any of them. That's why you see me debating any of the so-called alt-right people, because they're all a bunch of Darwinists. They're all grounding their systems on atheism. And in that regard, if we think about Islam, I mean, I have to wonder at the idiocy of these alt-right people, because how do you think you're going to ever defeat Islam with your Darwinistic, nihilistic atheism? It's utterly stupid. Your position is completely egotistical and just another version of self-worship. Meanwhile, you're fighting a religion that tells people and consistently, right, opposes like vaccines and has a lot of children. And yes, I know that the globalists support that. I've talked about that in many videos. But the alt-right people just can't seem to figure this out. Like, they can't figure out that my alt-right bathhouse Nietzschean type thing is not going to save anybody's civilization. It's not going to get you anywhere. And anyway, so I got 200 NOX. Is that North Korean Juke dollars? Give me them Juke coin. I don't know what a NOK is, but thank you for those NOX, dog. Duke Haas. What is your opinion on true orthodoxy in the old calendar issue? I think any position that argues that there's no grace in these churches is mistaken on their anthropology and their soteriology and their ecclesiology. So some of these groups, there's a great video about Seraphim Rose talking about some of these groups and how they basically cut themselves off from the rest of the world. And one of the problems with these groups is that, and I'm not saying it's true of all of them, but you have to watch out for the CIA will try to use some of the old calendarists, some of the weird wandering bishop jurisdictions, some of these little tiny groups to foment division. If you go to the Orthodox England site, you'll actually find a lot of good articles about the CIA using some of these small, tiny fringe groups to try to cause division in the canonical Orthodox churches. Of course they would. Do you think that the CIA wanted ROCOR to reunite with Moscow Patriarchate? Of course not. Now, the existence of ROCOR was provisional, right? But we're supposed to believe by some of these fringe groups that there's KGB everywhere, right? Putin is the Antichrist. Some of these goofballs. No. And some of the people promoting the idea of Putin as Antichrist and the KGB and the Soviets run Russia. One of these guys, his dad just happens to be British intelligence and works at the British Embassy, or did. He's passed away now. So I would tend to think that, maybe he works for British intelligence. Of course he does. I'm not going to name him. You can figure out who that is. But, yeah, I mean, that doesn't mean that everybody in these groups is necessarily bad-willed or a bad person, or, there's just a danger of schism. And I always come back to this, which I think was a great insight, because this kind of stuff has bugged me for a long time. It's similar to the problems I had in the world of Rome. What about SSPX? What about FSSP? What about all these little groups? So what about this group, that group? And one of the problems with this is the idea that you're going to find a specifically perfect church on earth, right? So, for example, if you look at the Apocalypse, chapters 1, 2, and 3, where you have the letters to the 7 churches, there were a lot of problems in those churches. Or Paul's letters to the Corinthians. These churches had a lot of problems, right? For example, the Spirit says to the church of Laodicea, you're lukewarm, and or one of the other churches, you have those that teach the doctrine of Belem there, which is like paganism, occultism. I mean, there's some serious problems in these churches, so you're not going to find some perfect group. And just because one patriarch says something wrong, I don't necessarily think that everybody is immediately in some juridical, legalistic way, all grace is cut off to you. That's ridiculous. I mean, that's just a tool of causing division. And a lot of the people that go into these fringe groups find out that it's not, the grass wasn't greener. It's not all it was cracked up to be. So what do I come back to? I come back to what Jesus says, to the 7 churches of Asia Minor in chapters 1, 2, and 3. There's not a perfect answer to all these situations that I can tell you what to do in every single case. I can't say that, maybe you have an OCA parish that's not that bad. Maybe it's terrible. Maybe there's there are some Greek churches that are not under the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese, right? And they're pretty good. So it's hard to say. There's not an easy solution to every one of these situations. You kind of have to go and test it for yourself. But Jesus said that you will know them by their fruit. And the good news is that over time, people tend to reveal themselves in their true motives, right? And we're seeing Bartholomew's fruit. And that you can apply that in your own situations. And if we think about Jesus himself as the example par excellence, you'll remember that Jesus in his day dealt with 2 kinds of people. He dealt with Pharisees who believed in a strict adherence to the written and the oral Torah, and that they were, according to Christ, the successors to the seat of Moses. They sat in the seat of Moses, but they were hypocrites. They didn't do what they taught. And then there was another group called the Sadducees who didn't believe in anything supernatural. They didn't believe in angels, spirits, or the resurrection. Now, of these 2 groups, who did Jesus say was correct? The Pharisees. Right. That might confuse some people, but the Pharisees theologically were kind of correct. They were more correct. They had actually the authority to sit in the, quote, seat of Moses because Ezra set up the synagogue system for the law to be taught in the different cities of Israel. And that's where you get the Pharisees from. They descend from Ezra, right? So they're not all bad. They were actually the authoritative leader. But guess what? They actually incurred greater condemnation and the worst condemnation because of their hypocrisy, right? If we think about the way Jesus talked to the Pharisees. So, but that doesn't mean that, the Sadducees were good guys because they were liberal. No. Jesus called the Sadducees, called the Sadducees hypocrites and phonies as well. So anyway, applying this to the modern day church, you're not going to find a perfect jurisdiction. You're not going to find a perfect group. You're not going to find, you could, if you wanted to find a reason in any church to not go there or to not commune or to not, you could do that. And at times, unfortunately, we may be called to, to not actually attend a church. That has happened many times in the history of the church. It can happen. In the Arian crisis, I think there were only 4 or 5 bishops in the entire empire that were not Arian or semi-Arian. And so that crisis took many years to pass. And the church is going to have to weather the present crisis of today's Arianism, as St. Nikolai Belem Ravitch called it, which is called Ecumenism, which is that Jesus is just one of the many paths, many ways. But it will pass as well. I'm not convinced that this is the last days. That's another trick, by the way, that psychological warfare can be used. They'll use these, it's the end, we're in the Antichrist system. That doesn't mean that everybody that thinks that we're in the end days is a tool of this. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that kind of stuff can be used as well. and it can be used, for example, in the sense that, because we're in the last days, and that's absolutely certain, if you attend any certain church, you are automatically condemned and you're an apostate, or something like that. It doesn't work that way. Life is not that black and white. And if there was no grace that extended to people who may have had or may have theological mistakes or wrong opinions, then none of us would be Orthodox at all. None of us would have gotten here because we've all had wrong opinions. We've all believed things incorrectly. And thank God in his mercy that he's able to lead us to correct opinions. So when it comes to ecumenism, it's not that difficult of a question. The ecumenism of return is the correct one. That was the purpose of ecumenical councils, was to bring people back into the unity of the church under their mother, the church. The false ecumenism is the one that is promoted by the UN and globalists and so forth, which says that all religions lead to the same end and we're all just using different interchangeable symbols, and that's Masonry. It's the exact same doctrine as Masonry. And it's the billionaire oligarchs that fund ecumenism. You see a pattern here? The billionaire oligarchs fund the coup in Ukraine. The billionaire oligarchs fund ecumenism. The billionaire oligarchs fund feminism. The billionaire oligarchs fund abortion. The billionaire oligarchs fund NGOs devoted to democracy and vaccines and GMOs. And are you seeing the pattern here? You're seeing the pattern here. Anyway, next question is, how would you order OCA, ROCOR, Antioch? Well, again, it's not like the entire group could easily be put on some scale, because I've met people and priests in all of these jurisdictions who are solid and who are great. And then in all these, you can have bad guys. So it's not like it's an easy solution. Let's see here. Oh, I got some more here. CS. What do you make of universalism being so big in Orthodoxy? Father Kimmel. Yeah. I think that actually the River of Fire by Kalamiros is insightful. And there is a different way to view eschatology from the Orthodox perspective, which doesn't have the Dante-esque, lava torments view, which actually doesn't make sense. So it is correct in Orthodox theology, I would say, to view the eschaton as determined by our willing in this life, right? So in other words, we can begin the experience of both heaven and hell, right? Theosis or damnation in this life, and that's based on the mode of our willing, what we will and what we choose. And I think God has set that up that way. Has set it up that way, and that's actually in accord with our anthropology. So one of the great things to read on this is actually St. Maximus the Confessor's analysis of the apokatastasis. Okay, so that's not Origenism. So when St. Maximus corrects the Origenism, what he does is he reformulates it into a situation that's in accord with St. Gregory of Nyssa and others who purged the apokatastasis from the heresies of Origen. And St. Maximus will speak of three different apokatastases. One is the restoration of the nature of humankind, and this is where we differ in terms of anthropology and metaphysics from Roman Catholics, is that it's Orthodox doctrine, there's no question about it, you actually have to believe this, that the recapitulation of Christ restores the entirety of Adam's nature. So that means that the only basis for resurrection for anybody is Christ. So he literally does destroy death for everybody. But you still retain the movement of your will, and so you're not forced into heaven. That's ridiculous. Your body is going to be resurrected, but your experience of eternity is going to be determined by your mode of willing in this life. And that's perfectly in line with our anthropology, which is a direct result of our council's Christology. So the Christology that's hammered out in the ecumenical councils is based on a specific revelation of human anthropology that leads to a certain kind of eschatology. And this is why we have a completely different eschatology from the Roman Catholics, because they don't have the same anthropology. And unfortunately, they have a different Christology. So this gets into the theology of recapitulation, which St. Irenaeus, St. Cyril of Alexandria, St. Maximus, St. John Damascus, many of the fathers teach. And that has implications for eschatology. Okay, so this is a little too much for right now, but you need to look into what St. Maximus Confessor talks about when he talks about three different apokatastases, right? So the first one is the restoration of human nature. The second is the restoration of all things in terms of the universe to their Edenic state or to their transfigured state, which is what they were intended to be. And then he says there's also a final restoration, which can be hoped for, that we don't know exactly what could happen. He says that it's possible that, for example, infants that died unbaptized, perhaps they're restored to a natural state, something like this. It's not purgatory. It's not anything like that. It's not the limbus patrum or the limbus infantum or whatever, the limbo of infants. It's not that. St. Maximus discusses different possibilities. And here is my analysis of this based on a lot. We don't know. We don't exactly know how it's going to work in the eschaton, and we don't understand how it is that, for example, free will can be maintained even in the eschaton. For example, one of the problems in Roman Catholic eschatology is that there are not multiple goods to choose because the only good is the essence of God. So if the only good is the essence of God, how do you retain free will in the eschaton? Because there's nothing else to choose. Orthodoxy is different. We don't believe that the essence of God is what we see ever, especially not in the eschaton. No beatific vision. We are resurrected in bodies, right? We're not mental phantasms floating around. We're not ghost spirits floating around. We have a body, and we have a new heavens and a new earth. So we will, in the eschaton, be functioning in very similar ways to how we function now, except that, of course, the natural world will not have the same fallen characteristics as it does after the fall of Adam. All right, so there will be in some sense, a reunion of spirit and matter, which in some sense has happened after the fall. There's been some kind of split or division. This is why Paul calls the resurrection body a spiritual body. That doesn't mean it's not physical. It means that it's a Holy Spirit motivated, moved, transfigured body, right? The body of Christ. Just think about when Jesus is resurrected, which is the pattern for all of us. He doesn't become an ethereal ghost. He doesn't become a mind floating around. He doesn't become a platonic form. He is resurrected in the exact same body with the hole in his side that Thomas puts his finger in. But it's a body that seems to have properties that are not subject to the limitations it had previously. So the resurrected body of Christ, doesn't have those limitations. Now, the limitations that it had prior to were limitations that he voluntarily accepted. It's not like Christ, what does Jesus say? You would have no power against me unless it were given to you, right? So Jesus voluntarily underwent death, right? He didn't. It wasn't like, oops, this happened. We didn't mean for this to happen. No, he willed it to happen. But in a sense, in some way, because he did take on the humanity that was consubstantial with us, right, from Mary, he did raise that humanity, as St. Cyril of Alexandria says. So that theosis, that deification of the human nature, results in a change of our being, right? We still retain our human nature, but it's restored and it's made conformable to the glory of his body, as John says in 1 John, right? When we see him, we shall be like him, for we shall see him as he truly is. So our bodies are going to be conformed to his bodies, and that's important because a lot of Protestants, a lot of evangelicals, and even a lot of Roman Catholics have a ridiculous Gnostic view where they think that the resurrection or the afterlife is like mines floating around or something. No, it's not. The resurrection of Jesus is what the resurrection is going to be like. So we'll have bodies. It'll be the same bodies we have. They'll be restored, and it'll be the way Eden was intended to be. And we know that a lot of things are going to be repaired and restored, but we don't know exactly how that relates to the damned. I'm not saying that that there's universal salvation. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that we are not told what the relationship between the resurrected in the eternal state and those who will to continue to oppose God, which you apparently can do that for all eternity. You can continue to will to oppose God. We're just not told how that works. And why would God tell us this? Because, how are we going to figure that out anyway, right? So when people ask those kinds of questions, which get really speculative and difficult, I'm reminded of the book of Job, right? I mean, Job starts like asking those kinds of questions, and God says, you don't even know how, I make the dew come in the morning. How are you going to try to figure out the relationship between good and evil in the eternal state? Right? I mean, in another sense, we don't want to say that evil takes on any quality of eternality, right? Evil doesn't continue for all eternity because we want to avoid Manichaeanism, right? We don't believe in two eternal principles fighting it out for all eternity. So I think that the answer to this is that we just simply don't know. There are some things that we're not ever going to know, as Paul says, the mystery of iniquity. We're not ever going to have a perfect explanation of how and why evil operates in this world, or in what sense evil, demons have an energy of evil. We're not going to know that. We know that it is so, but we may not in this life ever know how so. And we don't really need to anyway. I mean, it's not really conducive to the here and now to know all the mysteries of eternity. This is kind of why Paul says, when he has his vision, his noetic vision or whatever, and he says that I saw and I understood things that it's no longer lawful to speak, or it's not lawful to speak on earth. So there are mysteries of heaven that are not lawful to speak on earth. So we don't know. I don't know. And how would we know? I mean, we don't even know. There's so many things that we don't know. Why would we think that we could figure out this mega mystery? You know what I mean? And as you get older, you kind of get more reconciled to being okay with that. Like when I was in my 20s, it would really, like bug me, and it would really get on my nerve. I'd be like, I got to figure this out. Like how do we reconcile that? And that's kind of a phase that you go through when you're younger. And then as you get older, one of the things you learn as you get older is how much you don't know. I know that's kind of a cliche thing, but it really is true. And it's good because it actually brings a lot more peace as you get older, because you realize I'm not ever going to figure out all of these mysteries. Does that mean I have to be a relativist and I can't have certainty? No, of course not. Not at all. But it does allow a bit of peace and a bit of rest from the sort of manic drive to figure out every single thing. Maybe I'm just an autist. And maybe now that I'm past my 20s, I have rest from my autism. I don't know. But as you get older, I think you'll see that you can kind of have peace about these things, and you can realize that it's not about solving every single mystery. So anyway, that was a really long response to the fact that there is an Orthodox version of the apokatastasis that St. Maximus explains. It's not the same thing as Origen's universalism, or everybody is infallibly saved, or that there is anything like that. Obviously, Origenism in the sense of eternal recurring falls is condemned. I mean, that's obvious. But so a lot of people get confused on those things. So that is a difficult issue. I did struggle with that about 10 years ago, but once I read St. Maximus on it, it kind of that resolved the issue for me. There's a great paper on this. Let me see if I can remember the name of it. By Daniel Jones, Saint Maximus Apocatastasis recapitulate. I'm trying to remember. I'm gonna see if I can find it, and I will recommend it to you guys here. Yeah, amazing. It's still here. Yeah, it's at a couple different Orthodox sites. So to the person who asked me about the afterlife and that question, I found a lot of help in the essay by Daniel Jones called Synergy in Christ According to St. Maximus the Confessor. And you can find that PDF on a whole bunch of different sites. Not saying that everything Daniel Jones says is correct. We don't really interact anymore. We're not buds anymore. But that is a good paper. So look for Daniel Jones's paper, Synergy in Christ According to Maximus the Confessor. And by the way, you'll see in that paper the connection between proper Christology and anthropology. And he, by the way, he distinguishes it very well from Origenism. So that's a great paper that I read back in the day. Let's see here. What's the next question? As for Father Kimmel, I have read some good, insightful things at Kimmel's website, and he used to interact and debate with all of us on different websites back in the day when he was Roman Catholic. But I'm sad to see Kimmel take such an ecumenist bent, so I can't go along with Kimmel on that stuff. And I think he used to comment on my website a long time ago, but we haven't had any interactions in probably 8 years or so. I haven't kept up with him. I did read some of his more recent articles a year ago about Christology, which were insightful, but anyway. Please explain Paul Bunyan. $100. Holy crap, dude. Thank you, man. Please explain why the Eastern Orthodox were right, okay, and the Oriental Orthodox were wrong, as in Chalcedon, Monophysitism, Miaphysitism, and Duophysitist. Yeah, actually, this is a good one. I had the same struggles 8-10 years ago. And I'm going to tell you 2 books that will help you resolve this question. The first book that I read is by John McGuckin. And it's a tremendous treatment. And I think these are in my recommended reading sections, or at least it was before my site got deleted. I think it's still there. But the first book you want to read is this one. And he will give a great explanation of the Miaphysite issue. And he will show you how what happened after Chalcedon was that there was 2 readings of Chalcedon. There's the Nestorian analysis. Or excuse me, there's the Monophysite reading of it, and then there is our reading of it, the Kyrillic. We call it the Kyrillic reading of it, of Chalcedon. In other words, you can interpret Chalcedon in a Miaphysite, Monophysite, or a Orthodox view, what we call Kyrillian, because we believe St. Cyril was Orthodox. And then after you read that book, I would read this book, which really laid it home for me, because Maximus is who solves this issue, especially for us. And this has been in the recommended reading. And this is important because this refutes Calvinism. When you understand this doesn't just refute Miaphysitism, Monophysitism, or Monergism. it also refutes Protestantism and Calvinism because they have all the same errors. By the way, it also relates to the Augustinian doctrine of efficacious grace. You start to understand that the Christology and the anthropology are interlinked, and you can never have a point where the divine energy overtakes or supplants or controls the human energy. And that's because we don't adopt dialectics. And what St. Maximus shows in his dispute with Pyrrhus is that Augustinianism, in its soteriological sense, unfortunately, makes the mistake of thinking that you need to retain the overcoming of the human will by divine grace with irresistible or efficacious grace because of the natural antipathy or dialectical tension between the human will, the human energy, and God, right? The assumption is that the fall left man in such a state that he is naturally, in some way, there's some dialectical inherent tension between the human will and the divine. And that's not true. In the Orthodox view, there is a natural inherent sympathy between these two. Now, man is fallen and he's corrupt, and he tends to will away from God in his fallen state. But that doesn't mean that that is natural to him. Human nature is good. His corruptible state has put him in a situation where he tends to choose his passions over God. Right? That's the result of the fall. So we're neither Pelagian, nor semi-Pelagian, nor Augustinian, nor monophysite, nor monergistic. No, we base everything around the right Christology and the right anthropology, and it maintains the same golden chain of balance throughout all of these doctrines, whether it's the fall, whether it's man's anthropology, whether it's Christology, whether it's our doctrine of grace, or the doctrine of the sacraments, right? We don't have bread and wine replaced magically. No, we don't believe that. Not transubstantiation in our doctrine. There is a miraculous work there at the epiclesis, the calling down of the Spirit, but we don't believe it changes the bread and wine any more than Jesus' human nature was changed in the incarnation. That's crazy. All right, so our ecclesiology and our eschatology, all of these views stand or fall together. This is what, if you're really immersed in the church fathers of the first 1,000 years, you know that they argue this way. It's a golden balance here, right? It's a kind of perfect balance in any one of these positions. And what St. Maximus will argue against Pyrrhus is that it relies and falls back on dialectics. Now, I was a huge fan of Augustine in my 20s. I was a devotee of his. I read thousands and thousands of pages of his works, so I know what I'm talking about. And it is unfortunate that, yes, he did maintain some of his Manichaean ideas, some of his Platonic ideas, even when he was a Christian, even when he was a bishop. And one of those was the idea that grace is in a dialectical position against the will of man. And that's because of the fall. So he's not exactly a Calvinist, right? I mean, he's a bishop. He believes in relics and, the priesthood and all this kind of stuff. I mean, he's fully, in most senses, quote, Orthodox, but he does have some errors. And for us as Orthodox, we don't have a problem with that, right? Because we don't follow one dude. It's more of a Latin thing to follow a dude. We follow that Pope. We follow Thomas Aquinas and the Pope because Pope said follow Thomas Aquinas. We follow the church in its universal sense, right? The mind of the church is something that's a mystery. It's both one and many. That's why the Orthodox doctrine of the church is synodal. It's not papal, it's synodal. Look at the early church documents that relate to all the synods. There was ecumenical councils and synods. You don't even need that. If it's papal infallibility, why bother with all this council nonsense? Just do what the Pope says. Do what that guy says, right? You don't need synods. Synods are a waste of time and energy. Anyway, but what the answer to your question on the Monophysite issue is the answer to all of these theological questions. Every one of the disputes is solved by Orthodox Christology across the board because they all relate back to our first principle. What's our first principle? God and the incarnation. And if you get those two things right, everything else will follow perfectly. That's why the church historically dealt with those things first. So all you have to do is read 2 books, and you will be, that will solve that issue for you. I'm trying to pull it up here if I can find it. Yeah, here it is. This is in my recommended reading as well. This was actually just going to be like a quick stream, but I don't mind answering all you guys' questions. Appreciate it. And I think Rocor puts this one out. I bought it actually at the San Francisco Cathedral, where the relics of St. John are. So it's great to see that this is published. And what you'll see Maximus show in this work is that the presuppositions of purists and the Monophysites are dialectics. Since there just has to be a dialectical opposition between the will of man and God's grace, we have to believe that there's one energy in Christ. One energy in Christ means that there's efficacious grace and salvation, right? The grace of God has to overcome your human will and energy, right? That's what happened in Jesus. The grace of God overcame in the incarnation the human will and energy of Christ, replaced it. You see how the Christology affects the soteriology directly? That's the whole argument in this book. And against Roman Catholics, by the way, this whole book is premised on the essence-energy distinction. And Pope St. Agatha's letter to the Sixth Council, which is based on this book that you see here on the screen, says there's a distinction between the essence and energies in Christ. His argument, Pope St. Agatha's letter, posits the essence-energy distinction. Are you listening to me, Catholics? The Pope's letter to the Sixth Council. The Sixth Council's entire argument is based on this book and this dispute. Well, not just this one, but Maximus largely. That's the answer. And you're talking to somebody who dealt with that I struggled with that for a long time. So there you go. Any thoughts on Nietzsche's eternal return theory? Yeah, I've actually trying to remember where I dealt. I think it's okay if you watch. I don't know if you're a subscriber or not, but if you watch the New Testament, can the New Testament documents be proven? Part 2 of that talk deals with Nietzsche's eternal return. I think in the analysis when I debated Richard Spencer, I think the part 2 of that deals with it. But there's multiple problems with eternal return, one of which is that you could never know it if it was true, because it leads to basically a kind of like Zeno's paradox, or a view where all change is basically illusory. But the problem is that everything in your life, in some sense, has resulted from you changing, right? So you learning things is connected to a change of affairs within time and space, right? Your history. You've learned things throughout your history, right? So that has, in some sense, related to the change of time within time, the change of movement of objects within time and space. Well, if that's all illusory, then your coming to know the truth of eternal recurrence is also illusory. So it's a stupid, pagan, self-refuting, mystical, gobbledygook nonsense doctrine, just like all Far Eastern thought. All Far Eastern thought is based on some kind of delusional, contradictory denial of reality, right? The Dalai Lama type crap. The Sphinx from Mystery Men. Why do the Emeridox quote C.S. Lewis like a church father? Well, that's because in many ways he came close to us. You know, he kind of touched on theosis. So I think a lot of people are well-intentioned in the sense that they want to see him as a bridge to talking to people in the West, Western Christians, or Western professing Christianity. And so I don't have a problem with that. I mean, I like Narnia. The Great Divorce, that is a great way to explain the Orthodox perspective of hell. So all that stuff I was saying earlier about the Orthodox view of hell, you could actually just read The Great Divorce and it would tell you, because he is laying that out. Screw Tape Letters, that's a great book. I loved it. It's definitely worth reading. You could see it as a kind of literary version of spiritual warfare, maybe. And there's always been an attempt to kind of have dialogue between Anglicans and Orthodox, but of course the Anglicans have just gone so far off the rails that it's really pointless. But unfortunately, if you read that essay I mentioned at the beginning about the preliminary notes on the influence of Freemasonry in early Greek ecumenism, it would seem to suggest that some of the Anglican contacts who were trying to engage in ecumenism were Freemasons, and that would make perfect sense because they would be emissaries of the British Empire. And the Orthodox have tried to have different, periods of dialogue with Anglicans because, in ways, they're not Roman Catholic, and they're not completely evangelical. So, people thought, well, maybe we could have some kind of dialogue, and maybe at one time there could have been dialogue with Anglicans. I don't know, but now, the guy who runs the Anglican Church, their pseudo bishop, is a Druid. The Archbishop of Canterbury is a Druid. And all of his talk about loving orthodoxy is just that, talk. This guy is something else. And it also relates to the criticism I made not too long ago of why does the Orthodox world send their people to Cambridge and Oxford to be trained when that's like the center of British intelligence operations, recruiting people, all this nonsense? No. So anyway, but I will agree with you, Lucius, that C.S. Lewis is also very problematic. So we shouldn't overlook the fact that he says a lot of ridiculous things. Like, I remember one time I was reading his book on the Psalms, and C.S. Lewis says something stupid like, we should never read imprecatory prayers because they're not of Christ. I'm like, what a retarded thing to say. The Spirit of Christ inspired the Psalms. You have to believe that as a Christian. That's in the Nicene Creed. I believe in the Holy Spirit who spake by the prophets. So that's just completely stupid. And there's plenty of Orthodox prayers and prayer books over the years that include imprecatory prayers. Many of the liturgical days include imprecatory prayers. Did you know that? No, because the Emeridox, they delete and they get rid of all that because it's not ecumenical. Well, we don't want that. We want anathemas. Like that. There's that awesome anathema video. Did you know, by the way, that the Triumph of Orthodoxy Sunday, there's you sing all these anathemas? Why are we not singing these anathemas? We should be. Did those heresies all disappear? No, they're everywhere. We ought to be singing the anathemas now more than ever. I'm going to put that one in the chat because I really like that one. The anathemas from the Triumph of Orthodoxy Sunday. You should send this to all your ecumenist friends, and of course they'll try to explain it away. And could I play this? I'm thinking I could play it. I don't think this would be copyrighted. Would it be? Sometimes these Orthodox chants are copyrighted, so I don't know. Now my computer's freezing up, so I don't know if it's gonna... Here we go. Yeah, and by the way, Metropolitan Piraeus, he still reads the anathemas. You can... And he called out Bartholomew, and he calls out Francis, which is good, by the way. So even though our gay Orthodox leaders in America don't want us to read out these anathemas, in other places of the world they do. So we can have hope for that. But here is this great video. If you never did see it, I'm going to put it in the chat, because I don't know if I can play this or not, if it'll work, if it will ding me for copyright or something. I was we're looking at the chat a little bit here. Anyway, there's that. That's from Triumph of Orthodoxy Sunday, where you read the anathemas, and the Russian anathema liturgy there is pretty awesome. You guys can play that on your own, but I don't want to get struck with some copyright thing, so I'm not going to play it out loud. But it's really good. CS for $4.99. Reading One of the Many Now by Rushdoony. Jim Jordan, John Edwards, T.F. Torrance. Can you say good things about the Reformed tradition and the overlap with Orthodoxy? Well, not really. I mean, I'm from the Reformed world, right? So I was a Calvinist for a long time. I went to Bonson Seminary. For those of you that may not know my background, when I was 18, 19, when I started reading the Bible, I got into Calvinist circles, and I definitely learned a lot. I mean, if you go to my recommended reading lists, I will recommend One in the Many, which is a good book. I do recommend Through New Eyes by Jordan, and I do recommend a couple Bonson books, but that's it. So I'm not going to recommend anybody else. And that's because for all their insights, there's not much else there. I mean, James Jordan, all those insights he got from Eastern Orthodox Christianity anyway, and he just repackaged it as his, quote, insights. So even though I'll recommend a few of those books, I'm not going to say anything beyond that. Jonathan Edwards is a lunatic. He actually held multiple heresies that were very bizarre. So I'm not at all going to recommend Jonathan Edwards. I've never read T.F. Torrance. A lot of people recommended him, but I mean, I left Protestantism 20 years ago, so not much I can say in favor. I haven't been inside of a Protestant or Calvinist church in, I don't know, since, what year is it, 2018? In 15 years. It's been 16 years since I stepped inside a Protestant church. I haven't missed it at all, by the way. But yeah, Bonson's got some great books. You can read Van Til to get some insights on apologetics. If you go to my recommended reading list, you'll see some of that stuff there. You'll even see Father Schuping's book where he points out similarities between presuppositional apologetics and St. Irenaeus. So there's definitely some worthwhile stuff in some of those guys, but on the whole, no. There's little beyond that worth perusing. Rushdoony. Problem with Rushdoony ultimately is that he ended up Nestorian, and there were rumors that on his deathbed he was close to orthodoxy. So, God have mercy. Maybe that's true. I don't know, but maybe Rushdoony had a deathbed conversion. He believed. I don't know, but supposedly he was reading Schmemann or I don't know, something like that. But no, there's not really much more I can say. I mean, the problem with theonomy and all that is that it kind of comes close to the idea of the Orthodox Imperium, but all the theonomy idiots, they all want to have libertarian free market economics, and they want to have religious liberty at the same time as believing in theonomy. I mean, I'm sorry, but if you believe in theonomy, There's no religious liberty, dude. God doesn't tolerate all these different sects. But they have to say that because in their view, there's not one historic church. There's no Orthodox Church, right? There's a million different competing sects within history that claim to be the church. So your reaction to the hatred of Augustine, J2BNK, N-I-K. It's not a hatred of Augustine. It's a legitimate criticism of Augustine. And I say that as a person who came from the Roman Catholic world as a big fan of Augustine and Aquinas. So the Orthodox are correct in their criticisms of Augustine when it comes to incorrect soteriology and anthropology and ultimately, unfortunately, Christology. If you read Free Choice and Maximus the Confessor, there's a great chapter where Dr. Farrell explains that the unfortunate conclusion to, if you adopt Augustine's limited soteriology, in other words, that Christ ultimately died efficaciously just for the elect, that has implications for Christology as a whole. And it means that you lose the recapitulation. And this has a lot of, I'm going to repost my article on this called The Western Loss of Theophanies, because I got deleted, but I mean, I have it backed up, but it's not public that I'm aware of, unless I put it on Sold. It might still be on Sold East. But if you read that, that'll answer your question on the real reason why Augustine is problematic. J2BNIK. But yeah, so, a lot of times people they're not even getting what the issue is. And the issue relates to the Augustinian soteriology and anthropology. And because he held to, as I said earlier, the dialectical tension between grace and divine will, and he held that because of his view of the fall, and he held that because of his view of divine predestination. And in the Orthodox view, predestination and free will are another mystery, right? Again, if you want to understand the conciliar approach to Christology and all this stuff, anthropology, doctrine of the church, we basically just avoid dialectics, and we don't have a problem with symphonia or harmony throughout. So we avoid the Platonic, the Western, the Aristotelian, the Greek, the Hellenic tendency to want to stress dialectical tensions or principles that are in opposition. And this just simply means that it's the Greek, the Hellenic, the philosophic assumption that because something is distinct, it's in tension. No, it's not. God can create something distinct and it not be in tension. Right? Day and night are not somehow in oppositional defiance or intention. They're harmonious. Right? Church and state do not have to be in dialectical tension. They're harmonious. God and man do not have to be in dialectical opposition or tension. They're harmonious. The one and the many are not in dialectical tension. They're harmonious. And ultimately for us, our doctrine of the Trinity proves that. Right? The Trinity is the ultimate harmonization of the one and the many. They're not in dialectical tension. They're not blended together. They don't lose their uniqueness. This is why in Orthodoxy you don't have a super bishop, you don't have a mega church. You have one and many in perfect balance. This is why the first millennium of the church, as its symbol, is the Byzantine double-headed eagle, right? Church and state working in symphonia. That's a Christian symbol, not Masonic or any of this nonsense. So the issue of Augustine, I can solve it very easily for you, and that's because the church historically solved it after centuries of dealing with that issue. From the time of Augustine up to St. Maximus the Confessor, the church deals with the implications of that in terms of dialectical opposition between the will of man and the will of God, or between the will of man and grace. And that's dealt with in the Monophysites. So read the book, Disputation with Pyrrhus. Weathertop Studio, 1999. Thank you very much. I attended my second Divine Liturgy in Portland this past weekend. It was OCA, I believe. Is the OCA okay place to start my path? I know you have said steer clear of the Greek. Yeah, I mean, I would steer clear of the Greek that are Greek Orthodox archdiocese, and that's the ones that are probably they're if anybody follows Bartholomew, which so far nobody has that I'm aware of. I haven't seen the news yet today, but if anybody follows Bartholomew, it will be the Greek Archdiocese of North America. So if that happens, you have to avoid them. I would say avoid them already, because they are already saying don't make converts of anybody in their official manuals. But as to that specific OCA parish, I can't speak to that. I don't know. But, I mean, there's a lot of good and bad in these different groups, like I said. So you have to take it by case basis. And let me think. I know 3 or 4 OCA ministers and parishes, and it's a mixed bag. So, I can't say. But unfortunately, the OCA is, hopefully surely they're going to oppose Bartholomew, but we'll have to see. Basically, let's put it this way. This situation with Bartholomew, it's going to be a great litmus test for everybody. It's going to be a great way for everybody to publicly see and which things are very clearly evil and which things are not. So, in a way that this is, I was just reading actually Amos, and Amos says this, there's this quote in Amos where God says, I'm going to sift the wheat from the chaff, and I'm going to make it very easy for everybody to see who's good and bad. And I was thinking, wow, that's applicable to right now. Christopher Shada for $5. Did you ever get a hold of Bible as Lit podcast? No, I didn't, but the name that you gave me rang some alarm bells. Between that podcast and you, I'm definitely becoming Orthodox. Okay, well, awesome, man. Glad to hear that. God bless you. Definitely not the wide path. No, I would say it's not. But I'll leave you with kind of a final ending note from the beginning of the podcast, who was Saint Nikolai Belem, Ravitch, who warned you of Freemasonry. And he does it again. He says, the only keeper of the secret to the church is the only keeper of the secret of the present wars. Now, I guess he's writing in terms of the church. Let me make sure I'm reading this right. It's like somebody posted like a whole book here. And socialism, Masonry, philanthropy, Rousseauism, all of these are only small units of the great treasury that the Christian church hides under her clouds of dust and errors and miseries. All non-Christian systems and schemes mean my own interest first and then thine. Am I reading the right thing here? Yeah, the present war is a result of the de-Christianization of Europe. So he's talking about the world wars of, I think he's talking about World War I. She is the only thing which makes European civilization not lower than Egypt, Babylon, etc. Nothing will survive out of all these wars than the church. And I like that he's telling you that behind socialism, Masonry, philanthropy, Rousseauism, that's what's behind the present crises. And do you think Nikolai Belem Ravitch is the only person who saw that? No. Father Seraphim Rose tells you about Ecumenism. He tells you about Freemasonry, the Illuminati. He talks about it. And their plan to dethrone Christianity. CS 499. Yeah, I've read Solovyev's book. He makes an argument for the Pope. Necessary is the proper balance between the one and the many. Read Church, Papacy, and Schism by Philip Sherrard. The last chapter refutes that. So, very sad that Sherrard went liberal, but you can really find some great insights in his books, even still. I'm not going to recommend Lineaments of a Sacred Tradition. That book is not very good. But the last chapter of Church, Papacy, Schism has one of the best arguments I've ever seen. It's great. So put this one up. I mean, there's a lot of great insights in this book, like where he talks about the weird distinctions that cropped up between the juridical body of Christ and the mystical body of Christ to justify the papal bureaucracy. That's a great section. But the last chapter is just like gold, man. I mean, he nails it. He shows you how. And the thing is that if Solovyev or any of those characters, he was just an agent of this Western stuff. I mean, that was his role, was to try to bring Russia back under the sway of the West, and the papacy was already functioning in that capacity. So keep in mind that it's not always about the theology. But another thing I'll say in response to that is that, first of all, the idea that the Roman Catholic Church is free from the bullying of the state is laughable. The Roman Catholic Church was set up by the Franks. The Frankish popes, Charlemagne and their descendants, are the ones who brought in all of these changes and brought the schism. There probably wouldn't have been a schism if the Frankish theologians had not introduced all kinds of liturgical changes, such as the introduction of the statuary, the removal of paedo communion. This is why the Roman Catholics don't practice paedo communion, and the entire church did for the first 800 years. Hello, indicators. The Franks are behind the rise of the popes after the schism. They're the ones that set up an entirely new emperor. There was already a Christian emperor. The Seventh Ecumenical Council already said he is the God-ordained emperor, right? In Constantinople. So the Pope ordaining a new emperor when the other one wasn't even heretical was ridiculous. I mean, the 7 ecumenical councils and the 8th are called by the emperors. They're not called by the Pope. The fact that the Roman Catholic Church claims, this is what I tweeted the other day, right? The Roman Catholic Church claims that you can't maintain a church without papal infallibility. Well, the Orthodox Church has not had papal infallibility for the last 1,000 years, and we're still here. And Rome admits that the Orthodox Church has maintained its existence for the last 1,000 years without Roman Catholic infallibility. Therefore, we don't need papal infallibility. Condemned out of their own mouths. So, it's illusory. The idea that Francis gives everybody unity. Have you experienced the world of Roman Catholicism? Do you think that there's unity between the Sedevacantists Chapel, the FSSP Chapel, the SSPX Chapel, the Novus Ordo Chapel, and the Indult Novus Ordo Chapel? You think there's unity between those? That's a delusion, dude. It's only in theory, only in name. So the unity of the papacy is not some mystical, magical thing. It's all in theory. And you say, well, how will the church be united without the office of the papacy? The Holy Spirit, that's how. Jesus said that the Holy Spirit would guide you into unity. Who presides in Acts 15? Not Peter. James. Peter's there in a subordinate role to James. So I mean, if a giant blackmail pedo cult network known as the Roman Catholic Church, if that doesn't wake you up to the fact that that's not God's representative on earth, nothing will. And I can't help you. I'm not dissing you specifically, CS. I'm speaking theoretically to people out there. I mean, what else is there to say? I mean, the Vatican is a giant blackmail mafia pedo network that has been co-opted by the CIA in the 20th century. And that doesn't come from some conspiracy theorist or some Orthodox lunatic. That comes from Roman Catholics. That comes from David Wimhoff, who is a mainline traditional Catholic. He's not even I don't think he's SSPX. Whatever he is. So, and, you know, anybody who doubts me and wants to go down the Rome, and I'm watching people now who, you know, didn't find me convincing. You know, okay, that's your business. They went down the route of Rome. I understand. I went that route. I spent many years there. I understand the appeal. I understand the grass is greener. I understand that maybe you're a Protestant. You're looking between Rome and Orthodoxy. I understand. But you're going to find all the same problems. You're going to find out that it's not, the grass isn't greener. And I'm not saying that every Roman Catholic's bad. No, it's not like that. There's a lot of great people, a lot of goodwill people. I still have a lot of friends that are Roman Catholic. And they are allied with us on many issues. But they're also not allied with us on many issues. And, you know, a lot of these complexities come into play. It does get very difficult. So, anyway, I did read the Solovyev book 10 years ago when I was trying to make kind of a decision between where to go and trying to map all this out. So I don't blame you. I'm not faulting you, but I found church papacy and schism far more convincing, and the arguments that the Pope somehow protects us from state influence is completely hollow, especially if you read David Wimhoff or if you look into the Frankish thesis related to Charlemagne. It all rings hollow to me. But I know at the time, I thought, oh, maybe that's a good argument. Maybe that's a good argument. Anyway, this was way longer than I expected. But thank you guys. This is a good talk. Hopefully we covered some good issues. We can use this talk maybe in the future to refer people to. And then somebody asked about Father Seraphim. Actually, yeah, Father Seraphim Rose he did have a period, it's rumored at least, where he was homosexual and then repented. So homosexuality in the case of Father Seraphim Rose, if it's true, which I have heard that that's true, but it wouldn't matter anyway because he repented of that. He had a period, I think, where he was influenced by progressive ideas, and he, you know, did his graduate studies in Chinese philosophy, and that was all prior to his conversion. So you will find in the church many people who were sinners prior to the conversion. And the church welcomes all sinners back into her bosom when they repent. Isn't the church supposed to give sanctuary to anybody that asks for it? What do you mean by sanctuary? I mean, I don't know if you mean like political sanctuary or do you mean spiritual sanctuary? If you mean spiritual sanctuary, yes, because if you read the Old Testament, you'll read about the sanctuary cities. And those are types of the church. War criminals? I don't know. It depends. I mean, the church historically was never opposed to the death penalty. In fact, the Code of Justinian, many Orthodox nations, kingdoms practice the death penalty. It's always been historically the norm in the East and the West. So you might be forgiven of your sins, but that doesn't mean that you're necessarily going to be evading the death penalty, depending on what your crimes might have been. Anyway, all right, thank you guys. This was a helpful talk. Hopefully we can shed some light on what's happened with Bartholomew, the history of it, and then we had a lot of theological questions. But the long and short of it is that ecumenism is bad news. It's nowadays not a situation where it's done to bring people back to the truth. It's done as a form of praxeology in terms of, I don't mean that in the Robert Taylor sense. I'm talking about in the Marxist sense of getting people to water down their positions, participate in Hegelian Marxist type dialectics, and because nobody has the truth. It's all a mystical search that we're all on to one day get closer to the truth, maybe, which is nonsense. And it's all at the behest of powerful interests and Freemasons in the British Empire and their buddies. And nowadays, the oligarchs. So Bartholomew is bad news. He's openly now supporting the CIA NATO puppets in the Ukraine, and it's all been made very clear for us. So God bless you guys. Have a good day, and stay tuned.